My name is Victoria Hayes. And the moment everything shattered wasn't marked by yelling or arguments. It was marked by the soft click of a lock and the weight of $15 in my palm. I stood on the front porch of the only home I'd ever known, Christmas lights blinking red and green against the December rain, while my own family stood on the other side of the door they'd just closed in my face. My brother Brandon smirked through the frosted window before pulling the curtain shut. In that instant, watching my breath fog in the freezing Portland air, I understood something that would change everything. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased. What they didn't know was that being invisible had taught me to see everything. And what I'd seen over the past few months would eventually put me on the other side of that door, not as their daughter, but as their landlord. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Hayes family Thanksgiving had unfolded exactly as every gathering had for the past decade. I arrived at the Craftsman house in the West Hills with a pumpkin pie I'd stayed up late baking, only to watch my mother set it on the far end of the counter, away from the main dessert display. Brandon walked in empty-handed 20 minutes late, and my father immediately stood to greet him with the kind of enthusiasm he'd never once shown me. The living room filled with the scent of roasted turkey, and that particular tension I'd learned to carry in my shoulders, the kind that comes from years of being present but unseen. Uncle Frank asked Brandon about his new Tesla. Aunt Caroline wanted to know about his latest property acquisition. When someone finally turned to me, it was only to ask if I was still doing that computer thing, as if my career in data analysis was a hobby I'd outgrow. I had positioned myself near the bookshelf, a spot that had become my unspoken territory at family events, far enough from the center of attention to go unnoticed but close enough to appear involved. My father held court near the fireplace, his voice booming as he discussed market trends and investment strategies. My mother fluttered around Brandon, refreshing his drink, asking if he needed anything, her attention fixed on him like he was the only child she'd ever had. Ashley, Brandon's wife, sat beside him with that rehearsed smile she wore at family functions, the one that said she knew exactly how valuable her position was in this household. I watched them all from my corner, the way I'd learned to watch, quietly cataloging the small cruelties that had become so routine no one even recognized them as cruelty anymore. Dinner proceeded with the usual script. My father sat at the head of the table, my mother to his right, Brandon to his left. I took my seat near the end, next to Uncle Frank, who spent most of the meal on his phone. Brandon dominated the conversation, talking about a development deal he was closing in the Pearl District, how he'd secured financing for a multi-unit renovation project, how the profit margins were going to exceed expectations. My father listened with pride radiating from every nod and smile. When I mentioned that my team had just completed a major analysis for a regional healthcare network, my mother glanced up briefly and said that sounded nice before turning back to ask Brandon if he wanted more stuffing. The dismissal was so smooth, so practiced that I almost didn't feel the sting anymore. Almost. After dinner, while my mother and Ashley cleared plates, I helped carry dishes to the kitchen. Brandon and my father retreated to the study, that wood-paneled room that had always felt like sacred ground where real decisions were made. I could hear their voices through the partially open door, low and conspiratorial. My father's laugh punctuated whatever Brandon was saying. I set down a stack of plates and moved closer, not quite eavesdropping but not quite walking away either. Brandon's voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments. Something about liquidity, something about a sure thing, something about keeping it in the family. Then I heard my name, followed by a pause, and then Brandon's voice again, quieter now but with an edge of amusement. She won't even notice. My stomach tightened. I stepped back into the kitchen before anyone saw me standing there. The rain started as I drove home that night, the kind of steady northwest downpour that turns streets into rivers of reflected light. My small apartment in Hawthorne felt especially cramped after spending the day in the sprawling house I grew up in. I made tea and sat by the window, watching water streak down the glass, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother reminding me that Christmas Eve dinner was at 6 and to please be on time this year. No mention of Thanksgiving. No acknowledgement of the pie I'd brought or the hours I'd spent trying to be part of a family that had never quite made room for me. I set the phone down and stared at the rain, wondering when I'd stopped expecting anything different. 3 days later, An envelope arrived in my mailbox. Thick, official, the kind that immediately makes your pulse quicken. I opened it standing right there in the lobby of my building, my hands already trembling before I even saw what was inside. It was a credit application for a commercial loan, $275,000, with my name listed as co-signer. My signature sat at the bottom of the page, neat and clear, except I had never signed anything. I read it twice, then 3 times, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The lending bank was Pacific Northwest Commercial. The loan origination date was 6 weeks ago. The property address listed was in the Pearl District. Brandon's development project. My throat went dry. I called the bank immediately, my voice shaking as I explained that I hadn't applied for any loan. The representative put me on hold, and I stood in my tiny kitchen gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. When she came back, her tone had shifted to something more cautious. She explained that the application showed both my signature and my social security number. A copy of my driver's license was attached to the file. Everything appeared legitimate. I insisted it wasn't, that someone had forged my information. She said she'd flag the account and open an investigation, but in the meantime, the loan had already been approved and disbursed. The words hit me like cold water. The money was gone, and my name was tied to it. I sat down hard on the edge of my couch, staring at the letter in my hand. My mind spun back through the past year, searching for moments that suddenly felt different under this new light. Brandon borrowing my laptop last spring to check some zoning maps because his tablet was dead. My parents asking for a copy of my license when they were updating their estate paperwork. My mother mentioning casually that Brandon was helping them organize all their financial documents. Every memory clicked into place with sickening clarity. I opened my laptop and searched for the property address listed on the loan. It was the same building Brandon had bragged about at Thanksgiving. The timeline matched. The amount matched. And my name was attached to a debt I never agreed to take on. That night I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios trying to convince myself there was some mistake, some explanation that didn't involve my own brother stealing my identity. But by morning the truth had settled into my bones with the weight of something I could no longer deny. I called an attorney someone a former colleague had recommended. His name was Marcus Thornton, and his office was in a sleek building downtown. When I explained the situation over the phone, his silence told me everything I needed to know. He asked me to bring every document I had and scheduled an appointment for the next afternoon. Marcus's office overlooked the Willamette River, glass windows framing the gray water and the bridges stretching across it. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the kind of calm intensity that comes from handling situations exactly like mine. I handed him the loan documents, and he read through them slowly, his expression darkening with each page. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me directly. "This is identity theft," he said. "And if your brother did this without your knowledge, it's also fraud." I felt the words land in my chest like stones. He asked if I had any proof that I hadn't signed the documents myself. I told him I'd never even seen them until 3 days ago. He nodded, already making notes. We were going to need more than that. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize. I filed a police report. I requested copies of every financial document tied to my name. I combed through my credit history and found 2 other inquiries I hadn't authorized, both from earlier in the year. Marcus worked with a forensic analyst who examined the signature on the loan paperwork. The analysis came back showing that my signature had been digitally copied from another document, likely a scan, and placed onto the application. It wasn't even a convincing forgery if you knew what to look for. But it had been convincing enough for the bank. I felt a bitter anger rising in me, not just at Brandon, but at myself for being so easy to deceive. Christmas was 2 weeks away. My mother called to confirm I was coming to Christmas Eve dinner, her tone light and unbothered, as if nothing in the world had changed. I told her I'd be there, even though every part of me wanted to refuse. But I needed to see them. I needed to look my brother in the eye and know for certain that he'd done this. Marcus advised me not to confront anyone until we had a full legal strategy in place, but I wasn't going to sit through another family performance without knowing the truth. I agreed to stay quiet, but I wasn't going to stay away. The days leading up to Christmas dragged with a strange, heavy anticipation. I went to work, sat through meetings, analyzed data sets, but my mind was always elsewhere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Turning over the pieces of the betrayal, trying to understand how my own family had decided I was worth so little. I thought about all the years of being overlooked, dismissed, set aside. I thought about every time my father had praised Brandon while barely glancing my way. I thought about my mother's endless excuses for him, her unwavering belief that he could do no wrong. And I realized that this wasn't new. This was just the first time the consequences had become impossible to ignore. On December 23rd, I received another call from the bank. The representative explained that their internal investigation had confirmed irregularities with the loan application. My information had been used without authorization. They were freezing the account and beginning the process to reverse the disbursement, but it would take time. Legal proceedings would likely follow. She apologized for the inconvenience. As if someone stealing my identity and destroying my credit was a minor scheduling conflict. I thanked her and hung up, feeling both vindicated and hollow. The proof was there. But it didn't undo what had already been done. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. The kind of winter night where the air bites at your face and the stars feel close enough to touch. I drove to my parents' house with the loan documents in my bag. Marcus's advice echoing in my head. Don't engage. Don't accuse. Just observe. The house glowed with white lights strung along the roofline, wreaths on every window, the picture of holiday warmth. I parked on the street and sat for a moment, staring at the front door, gathering the courage to walk into a place that no longer felt like home. Inside, the scene was exactly what I expected. Brandon and Ashley were already there, drinks in hand, laughter filling the space. My father stood by the fireplace in his usual spot, and my mother was in the kitchen putting final touches on dinner. Uncle Frank waved from the couch. Everything looked normal. Everything felt like a lie. I set my coat on the rack and moved into the living room, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Brandon glanced up and nodded, his expression unreadable. Ashley hugged me briefly, her perfume too sweet. My mother called from the kitchen asking if I could help set the table. I walked through the motions, placing silverware and folding napkins, while my heart hammered in my chest. Dinner was unbearable. I sat in my usual spot, picking at my food while Brandon told stories about his latest projects. He mentioned the Pearl District development casually, like it was just another success in a long line of successes. My father asked questions, nodding approvingly. My mother beamed. I stayed silent, watching him, searching his face for any flicker of guilt. There was nothing. Just confidence, ease, the comfortable arrogance of someone who believed he'd never be caught. At one point he looked directly at me and asked how my work was going. I said it was fine. He smiled and turned back to my father. The casual cruelty of it made my hands shake. After dinner, my father asked Brandon to join him in the study. I saw my chance. I excused myself to use the bathroom and instead slipped down the hallway, positioning myself just outside the study door. Their voices were low but audible. My father was asking about financing, about timelines. Brandon assured him everything was handled. Then I heard my father ask if I knew about the loan. Brandon laughed, a short, dismissive sound. She doesn't pay attention to anything, he said. And even if she noticed, what's she going to do? My father chuckled. The sound of it, that easy, complicit laughter, hit me harder than anything else. They both knew, and neither of them cared. I stepped back, my breath coming fast and shallow. I returned to the living room, my face burning, my thoughts spinning. My mother was serving dessert. Ashley was scrolling through her phone. Uncle Frank was half asleep in the armchair. Everything continued as if the world hadn't just cracked open beneath my feet. I sat down, accepted a slice of pie I didn't want, and decided that I was done pretending. I waited until my father and Brandon returned from the study. Then I stood, reached into my bag and pulled out the loan documents. I set them on the coffee table in front of everyone. The room went silent. I looked at my father first, then at Brandon, then at my mother who had frozen halfway through cutting another slice of pie. The loan documents sat on the coffee table like an accusation no one could ignore. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I asked Brandon if he recognized the papers. He glanced down at them, his face carefully neutral, before looking back at me with manufactured confusion. He asked what I was talking about. I told him exactly what they were. A commercial loan application for $275,000 with my name forged as co-signer. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Brandon's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, annoyance, then finally settling on something that looked like concern but felt entirely hollow. He said there must be some mistake, that he would never do something like that. Ashley set down her wine glass and moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that made my stomach turn. My father picked up the documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he scanned the pages. My mother stood motionless by the dessert table, her mouth slightly open, looking between Brandon and me as if trying to decide which reality to accept. I told them about the bank's investigation, about the forensic analysis that proved my signature had been copied and placed on documents I'd never seen. I explained that the loan had been used to finance Brandon's Pearl District project, the same one he'd been bragging about for months. My father set the papers down slowly, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker across his face, doubt maybe, or recognition. But then Brandon spoke again, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when he wanted to sound like the rational one in the room. He suggested that maybe there had been a clerical error at the bank, that these things happen sometimes, and that we shouldn't jump to conclusions. The audacity of it took my breath away. I asked him directly if he was denying that he'd used my information without my permission. He said of course he was denying it, that he couldn't believe I would accuse him of something so serious based on what was probably just a bureaucratic mix-up. My mother found her voice then, asking me softly if I was sure about all this, if maybe I'd signed something and forgotten about it. The question landed like a slap. I turned to her and asked if she genuinely believed I would co-sign a loan for nearly $300,000 and simply forget. She looked away, wringing her hands, unwilling to meet my eyes. My father stood, his presence filling the room the way it always did when he wanted to take control of a situation. He said we all needed to calm down, that this was Christmas Eve and we were family, and that whatever confusion existed could be sorted out after the holidays. His tone made it clear he considered the matter closed. I felt something crack inside me. Not the quiet break from Thanksgiving, but something louder, more final. I told him this wasn't confusion, it was fraud, and that I'd already filed a police report. The room went completely silent. Ashley's eyes widened. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Brandon's carefully constructed calm finally slipped, and I saw anger flash across his face before he caught himself. He stood up then, his height and presence suddenly feeling threatening in a way they never had before. He told me I was making a huge mistake, that I clearly didn't understand how business worked, and that if I just asked him he could have explained everything. I asked him to explain it now. He said the loan had been a temporary solution to a cash flow problem, that he'd planned to have my name removed once the project stabilized, and that he'd assumed I wouldn't mind helping out family. The words came out smooth and practiced, as if he'd rehearsed this explanation just in case. But they didn't explain why he'd never asked, why he'd forged my signature, why he'd stolen my identity instead of having a simple conversation. My father sided with Brandon immediately, saying that family helped each other, that Brandon had obviously intended to protect me from unnecessary worry, and that my reaction was disproportionate to what was clearly a misunderstanding. I felt the familiar pattern reasserting itself, Brandon at the center, everyone else orbiting around him, ready to excuse whatever he did. My mother suggested we all sit down and talk this through like adults. I remained standing. I told them that identity theft wasn't a misunderstanding, that forgery wasn't a family favor, and that I wasn't going to pretend this was anything other than what it was. Brandon's mask slipped further. He said I'd always been dramatic, always looking for reasons to feel victimized, always trying to make everything about me. The accusation was so perfectly inverted from reality that I almost laughed. Ashley tried to interject something about how stressful the holidays were, and how we should all take a breath. Uncle Frank, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing discomfort, quietly excused himself and left through the front door. Nobody tried to stop him. The house suddenly felt smaller, the Christmas lights too bright, the whole scene taking on a surreal quality, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I asked my father if he'd known about the loan before tonight. He hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. His eyes shifted to Brandon, then back to me. He said that Brandon had mentioned needing some additional financing and that he'd helped facilitate some paperwork, but that he hadn't realized my name was involved. The lie was transparent. I'd heard them in the study less than an hour ago, laughing about how I wouldn't notice. My father had known. They'd all known. And they'd decided together that I was expendable. My mother started crying then, soft tears that she dabbed at with a napkin, asking why I was doing this, why I was trying to ruin Christmas, why I couldn't just let things be. Her tears had always been her most effective weapon, the thing that made me feel guilty for having needs or boundaries or objections. But something had changed in me over the past 2 weeks. I looked at her crying and felt nothing but a distant sadness for the relationship we'd never actually had. I told her I wasn't ruining Christmas, that Brandon had done that when he committed fraud, and that I was simply refusing to pretend it hadn't happened. Brandon took a step toward me, his voice dropping to something meant to sound menacing. He told me I needed to think very carefully about what I was doing, that if I pushed this forward I would be tearing the family apart, and that I would regret it. The threat was barely veiled. My father stood beside him, his expression hard, and I understood in that moment that I was facing both of them, united against me. My mother continued to cry quietly, but she didn't move to defend me, didn't question Brandon's threat, didn't ask him to explain himself further. She simply stood there, choosing him the way she always had. I picked up my bag and told them I was leaving. My father said that if I walked out that door, if I continued with this accusation, then I was making a choice about where I stood in this family. The ultimatum was clear. I could let this go and remain in their good graces, or I could pursue the truth and lose them entirely. I looked at each of them in turn, at Brandon's barely contained anger, at my father's cold authority, at my mother's tear-stained face. I asked if they were seriously suggesting I should just accept being defrauded to keep the peace. Nobody answered. The silence was answer enough. I walked to the coat rack and pulled on my jacket. Brandon called after me, his tone shifting to something almost pleading, saying that we could work this out, that he'd pay me back, that this didn't have to be such a big deal. I turned back and told him that the money wasn't the point, that the betrayal was the point, that the years of being invisible and dismissed had led directly to this moment where he thought he could steal from me without consequence. My voice shook, but I kept going. I told them that they'd built a family around the idea that Brandon mattered and I didn't, and that I was done accepting that arrangement. My father's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before, a cold fury that made the air feel dangerous. He said that if I left now, if I insisted on pursuing this legal nonsense, then I shouldn't bother coming back. My mother gasped and said his name like a weak objection, but she didn't contradict him. Brandon stood with his arms crossed, watching me like he was waiting for me to break. Ashley looked at the floor. The Christmas tree lights blinked their cheerful pattern in the corner, absurdly out of place in the wreckage of the evening. I told my father I understood, that I heard him clearly, and that I accepted his terms. Then I opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing December night. I made it 3 steps down the walkway before I heard the door open behind me. For a brief, foolish second I thought someone was coming to apologize, to call me back, to choose me for once. Instead, my father's voice cut through the cold air telling me to wait. I turned around. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of the house, holding something in his hand. He walked toward me and held out a $20 bill. He said I'd need gas money. The gesture was so casually cruel, so perfectly designed to remind me of my place, that I couldn't immediately find words. I stared at the bill in his hand, at his face showing no trace of irony or affection, just a kind of dismissive practicality. Behind him, I could see Brandon watching from the window, his expression unreadable in the shadows. My mother had disappeared back into the house. The cold bit at my face and hands. My father thrust the money toward me again, impatient now. I took it, not because I needed it, but because refusing it would have required a conversation I no longer had the strength for. He told me to think about what I was throwing away, that family was supposed to forgive, and that pride had destroyed better people than me. Then he turned and walked back into the house. The door closed with a solid final sound. The lock clicked. I stood there holding $20, which I realized with bitter irony was actually just $15 after I looked more carefully at the crumpled bills, staring at the house where I'd grown up, where every window glowed with warmth and light and the illusion of belonging. My car sat at the curb, cold and dark. The neighborhood was silent except for the distant sound of Christmas music drifting from someone else's celebration. I got in my car and sat there for a long time, my breath fogging the windows, my hands shaking from more than just the cold. I looked at the $15 on my passenger seat and felt the full weight of what had just happened. I'd been erased. Not just dismissed or overlooked but actively removed, cast out with barely enough money for a tank of gas. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror, and I made a promise to myself right then. I would never be this powerless again. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and empty roads. Portland looked different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The city I'd always known suddenly felt full of possibility and threat in equal measure. I parked in my usual spot and climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, the building quiet with everyone else off celebrating with their families. Inside, my apartment looked exactly as I'd left it, small and plain and completely mine. I sat on my couch in the dark, still wearing my coat, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The anger came first, hot and sharp, at Brandon for stealing from me, at my parents for protecting him, at myself for being surprised by any of it. Then came the grief, heavy and aching, for the family I'd wanted but never actually had, for the childhood I'd spent trying to earn love that was never going to be freely given. And finally, underneath it all, came something else, something harder and brighter. Determination. I'd spent my whole life making myself smaller to fit into their idea of who I should be. I was done shrinking. I called Marcus the next morning, Christmas Day, knowing he wouldn't answer but needing to leave a message anyway. I told him everything that had happened, my voice steady and clear in the empty apartment. I said I wanted to move forward with every legal option available. I wanted the loan investigated fully. I wanted Brandon prosecuted if possible. I wanted my name cleared and my credit restored. And I wanted them to understand that I wasn't going to disappear just because they decided I was inconvenient. Marcus called me back that afternoon. His voice warmed despite the holiday interruption. He said he'd been hoping I'd make that decision. We scheduled a meeting for the day after Christmas. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state. I went through the motions of regular life while simultaneously building a case against my own family. Marcus connected me with a financial crimes investigator who specialized in identity theft. We compiled documentation, timelines, evidence of every instance where my information had been accessed or used without my permission. The investigator, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh who worked for a property management firm, but had previous experience in fraud detection, found additional irregularities. Brandon had used my credit for preliminary inquiries on 2 other properties earlier in the year. The pattern was clear and deliberate. My phone stayed silent. No calls from my parents. No messages from Brandon. It was as if I'd been completely excised from their lives the moment I walked out the door. Part of me kept waiting for my mother to reach out, to ask if I was okay, to express some small gesture of concern. But the silence stretched on, and I realized that in their minds I'd already made my choice. I'd chosen conflict over compliance, truth over convenience. And for that I deserved nothing. New Year's Eve arrived gray and wet, typical Portland winter weather. I spent it alone in my apartment, watching the rain streak down my windows, thinking about everything that had changed in the span of a single week. A year ago I'd been at my parents' house for their annual New Year's party, standing in my usual corner, watching Brandon hold court. This year I was here, alone but somehow less lonely than I'd been in that crowded room. My phone buzzed at midnight with automated holiday greetings from my bank and my phone company. Nothing from my family. I poured myself a glass of cheap champagne and toasted to the empty room, to whatever came next. January brought a cold clarity. Marcus filed formal complaints with both the bank and the county prosecutor's office. The bank's fraud department launched a full investigation, freezing not just the loan in question but several of Brandon's other accounts pending review. I learned this not from any official source but from a terse email Brandon sent me at 2 a.m, his first communication since Christmas Eve. He said I was destroying his business, that I was being vindictive and petty, and that I'd regret this when I realized what I'd done to the family. I didn't reply. The prosecutor's office moved slower, as government agencies always do, but Marcus assured me they were taking it seriously. Identity theft with amounts over $100,000 qualified as a Class B felony in Oregon. If they found sufficient evidence, Brandon could face significant legal consequences. I tried not to think too much about what that would mean, about my brother potentially facing criminal charges because of my decision to pursue this. But then I'd remember the smirk through the window on Christmas Eve, the casual cruelty of my father handing me $15, and my resolve would harden again. In mid-January, I received a letter from an attorney representing my parents. The language was formal and cold, informing me that due to my recent actions and accusations against a family member, they were formally requesting I cease all contact and communication. The letter went on to state that any future contact would be considered harassment and could result in legal action. I read it 3 times, each time feeling like I was reading about someone else's life. My own parents had hired a lawyer to threaten me into silence. Marcus read it and shook his head, saying it was a pressure tactic, legally meaningless but emotionally calculated. He was right about the emotional calculation. It worked. I cried for the first time since Christmas Eve, not from sadness but from a rage so pure I didn't know what to do with it. February brought the first real break in the case. The forensic analysis of Brandon's financial records, subpoenaed by the prosecutor's office, revealed a pattern of irregular transactions that suggested he'd been operating beyond his means for at least 2 years. The Pearl District project had been financed almost entirely through leveraged debt, with my forged co-signature providing the additional creditworthiness the banks required. Without my name attached, the loan would never have been approved. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a methodical man named Robert Chen, called me into his office to walk through the findings. He explained that they were building toward charges but needed to establish clear intent, proof that Brandon had knowingly and deliberately committed fraud, rather than made an error. I asked how they proved intent. He said that's where things got interesting. They'd found emails between Brandon and my father discussing the loan application 3 weeks before it was submitted. The emails referenced needing additional credit backing and mentioned my name specifically. My father had written that I wouldn't notice and that even if I did, I wouldn't make trouble. Brandon had replied with a laughing emoji. The casual contempt in that emoji, the visual representation of how little they thought of me, hit harder than almost anything else. Robert Chun watched my face as I processed this and said quietly that this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. It showed premeditation and conspiracy. My father could potentially face charges too. The thought of both of them facing legal consequences should have brought me satisfaction. Instead, it just made me tired. I asked Robert Chun what happened next. He said they'd present the case to a grand jury within the next month, and if indictments were issued, arrests would follow. The word arrests made everything suddenly viscerally real. My brother and potentially my father, arrested because I'd refused to stay silent. Marcus, who'd accompanied me to the meeting, squeezed my shoulder and reminded me that they'd arrested themselves through their own choices. I knew he was right, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were 2 entirely different things. I left the prosecutor's office and walked down to the waterfront, needing air and space to think. The Willamette River moved slowly beneath the bridges, gray and cold under a February sky. I stood at the railing and watched the water, thinking about current and momentum, about how once something starts moving in a particular direction, it becomes very hard to stop. I'd set something in motion on Christmas Eve that was now rolling forward with its own weight and speed. There was no going back. Even if I wanted to drop everything, which I didn't, the state had taken over. It was out of my hands now. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My mother's voice came through, thin and strained, asking if we could talk. My first instinct was to say no, to remember the lawyer's letter, to protect myself from whatever new manipulation this might be. But I was also desperate to hear something, anything that sounded like she actually cared what happened to me. I agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory, public and safe. She arrived 10 minutes late, looking older than I remembered. The week since Christmas had carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. We ordered coffee and sat by the window, the silence between us heavy with everything unsaid. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking me to drop the charges. I told her I hadn't filed charges, that the state was pursuing the case based on evidence of fraud. She said it was the same thing, that I was destroying Brandon's life, destroying the family, and for what? Her question hung there, genuinely baffled, as if she couldn't comprehend why I would choose justice over loyalty. I asked her if she understood what Brandon had done. She said it was a mistake, that he'd made a bad decision under financial pressure, that he hadn't meant to hurt me. I asked if she thought forging my signature multiple times and stealing my identity constituted a simple mistake. She looked away, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and said that families forgave each other, that this was what love meant, letting go of grudges for the sake of staying together. I felt something break loose inside me. A lifetime of trying to meet her expectations, trying to earn her love, trying to be good enough for a family that had never wanted me as I actually was. I told my mother that love shouldn't require me to accept being stolen from. I said that forgiveness didn't mean pretending something hadn't happened, and that family shouldn't be a shield that protected people from the consequences of their choices. She flinched at each word like I was striking her. Then she said something that revealed more than she probably intended. She told me that the house, the family home in the West Hills, was at risk. Brandon had taken out a second mortgage to cover some of his development costs, and with his accounts frozen and the legal troubles mounting, they were behind on payments. My father's retirement investments were tied up in Brandon's projects. If everything collapsed, they could lose it all. The revelation should have shocked me, but instead it clarified everything. This wasn't about reconciliation or concern for my well-being. This was about money, about protecting their assets and their lifestyle. My mother was sitting across from me, asking me to sacrifice my financial security and my sense of justice so that they could keep their house. I asked her directly if she was saying their home mattered more than what Brandon had done to me. She started crying, saying I was twisting her words, that I didn't understand how serious this was. I told her I understood perfectly. She wiped her eyes and said that if the prosecutor moved forward, if Brandon was actually charged, the publicity alone would ruin my father's reputation in the business community. Everything they built would be destroyed. I sat back and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw someone I'd spent my whole life trying to please, trying to make proud, trying to convince that I was worth loving. And I realized with perfect clarity that it had never mattered what I did or didn't do. In her hierarchy of concerns, I would always rank below Brandon, below my father, below the house and the reputation and the comfortable life she'd built. I asked her if she'd come here planning to apologize for Christmas Eve, for the lawyer's letter, for any of it. She looked confused, as if those things were so minor they didn't warrant discussion. That confusion told me everything. I stood up and told her I was sorry about their financial situation, genuinely sorry, but that I wasn't responsible for fixing the problems Brandon had created. She grabbed my hand across the table, her grip surprisingly strong, and begged me to reconsider. She said I was young, that I could rebuild my credit, that this wouldn't affect my life the way it would affect theirs. The argument was so breathtakingly selfish that I actually laughed, a short bitter sound that made the people at the next table glance over. I pulled my hand away and told her that her priorities were clear, and that I finally understood exactly where I stood. Then I left her sitting there, left my coffee half finished on the table, and walked out into the February rain without looking back. Marcus called me that evening with news. The grand jury had returned indictments faster than expected. Brandon was being charged with identity theft, forgery, and fraud. My father was charged as an accessory and conspiracy to commit fraud. Arrest warrants had been issued. They'd both be taken into custody within the next 48 hours. Marcus's voice was professional as he delivered the information, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. This was justice, he said. This was accountability. I thanked him and ended the call, then sat in my dark apartment trying to process how I felt. There was no triumph, no sense of victory, just a hollow awareness that I'd permanently severed the only family I'd ever known. The arrests made the local news. Portland's business community was small enough that a story about a real estate developer and his father being charged with fraud got attention. I saw Brandon's face on the evening broadcast, being led from his Pearl District condo in handcuffs, his expression a mixture of shock and rage. My father was arrested at his office, the footage showing him walking stiffly beside a police officer, his face carefully blank. The news anchor mentioned that the charges stemmed from identity theft involving a family member. They didn't name me, but anyone who knew the Hayes family could probably guess. My phone exploded with messages. Former colleagues asking if I was okay. Distant relatives demanding to know what was happening. A few people I'd gone to high school with reaching out with morbid curiosity disguised as concern. I ignored almost all of it. The only person I responded to was Jennifer Walsh from the property management firm, who'd helped with the financial investigation. She sent a simple message saying she hoped I was holding up, and that what I'd done took real courage. Her words meant more than she probably knew. Brandon and my father both posted bail within hours. I knew they had the resources and connections to avoid spending any real time in custody at this stage. But the damage was done. The arrest records were public. The charges were serious. And Brandon's business relationships, built on reputation and trust, began to crumble almost immediately. I learned this not from any direct source but from industry news. 2 of his major investors pulled out of projects. The Pearl District development stalled completely when the bank refused to release any additional funds. His carefully constructed empire was collapsing, and I was the catalyst. Part of me kept waiting to feel guilty about that. I'd been raised to prioritize family harmony, to smooth over conflicts, to make myself smaller so others could be comfortable. But when I examined my conscience honestly, what I found wasn't guilt. It was grief for the family. I'd wished I had, and relief that I'd finally stopped pretending. Brandon had made his choices. My father had made his. They'd gambled that I would be too weak or too loyal or too afraid to hold them accountable. They'd been wrong. March brought the preliminary hearings. Marcus prepared me thoroughly, explaining that I'd likely be called to testify, that Brandon's defense attorney would try to paint me as vindictive or confused, that the process would be grueling. I told him I was ready. The courthouse was a gray building downtown, all concrete and security checkpoints and the particular smell of institutional spaces everywhere. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom waiting to be called, watching lawyers in expensive suits move past with briefcases in confident strides. When I finally entered the courtroom, I saw my family for the first time since Christmas Eve. Brandon sat at the defense table looking thinner, his usual polish dimmed. My father sat beside his own attorney, his face carved from stone. My mother was in the gallery, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ashley sat next to her, both of them dressed in somber colors like they were attending a funeral. In a way, I suppose they were. The funeral of the family we'd pretended to be. I took the stand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor walked me through the timeline methodically. When had I first discovered the loan? What steps had I taken? How had I obtained my signature on these documents? I answered each question clearly, keeping my voice steady, my eyes forward. I didn't look at Brandon or my father. I focused on the facts, just the facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. The prosecutor entered the forensic analysis of the signature into evidence. He showed the emails between Brandon and my father discussing using my name. He established a clear pattern of deception and intent. Then Brandon's attorney stood for cross-examination. He was older, silver-haired, with the kind of expensive suit that signaled high-powered defense. He asked me about my relationship with my brother, whether we'd had conflicts in the past, whether I'd ever felt resentful of his success. I answered truthfully that yes, we'd had a complicated relationship, but that this case wasn't about sibling rivalry. It was about fraud. He suggested that perhaps I'd agreed to co-sign the loan and later regretted it. I stated firmly that I had never agreed to anything, had never even been asked. He implied that my memory might be faulty. I pulled out my phone records showing I'd had no communication with Brandon about any loan during the relevant time period. The attorney shifted tactics, suggesting that this was a family matter that should have been resolved privately rather than through the criminal justice system. I felt my composure slip slightly and said that identity theft wasn't a private family matter, it was a crime. He asked if I understood the consequences my testimony was having on my family's well-being. Marcus objected, the judge sustained it, but the question had served its purpose. It planted the idea that I was choosing revenge over mercy, that I was the one being unreasonable. When I stepped down from the stand, my legs were shaking. The hearing continued without me. Expert witnesses testified about the signature forgery. Bank representatives explained their security protocols and how they'd been circumvented. The evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the day, The judge ruled that there was sufficient cause to proceed to trial. Brandon's face went pale. My father remained expressionless. My mother sobbed quietly into a tissue. I left through a side exit, unable to face any of them, and drove home through rush-hour traffic feeling absolutely drained. The weeks leading up to the trial were a special kind of torture. I went to work, performed my job analyzing healthcare data, attended meetings, and pretended everything was normal. But underneath the surface, I was constantly bracing for the next development. The local news continued to follow the story. A few reporters tried to contact me for comment. I refused all interviews. My coworkers knew something was happening but were too polite to ask directly. I appreciated their discretion even as I felt increasingly isolated by the secret I was carrying. In early April, Marcus called with unexpected news. Brandon's legal team had approached him about a plea deal. They were offering to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for avoiding trial. The deal would include full restitution to me, restoration of my credit, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and probation instead of prison time. My father's charges would likely be dropped as part of the agreement. Marcus asked how I felt about it. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted my day in court, wanted a jury to hear everything and validate my experience. But another part of me just wanted it to be over. I asked Marcus what he recommended. He said that from a purely practical standpoint, the plea deal guaranteed the outcome we wanted without the uncertainty of trial. I'd get my credit cleared, get financial compensation, and Brandon would have a criminal record. The downside was that it would feel less like justice and more like a transaction. I told him I needed time to think about it. He said I had 48 hours before the offer expired. I spent those 2 days walking along the waterfront, sitting in coffee shops, trying to figure out what I actually wanted from all of this. What I realized was that I didn't want revenge. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted Brandon and my father to admit what they'd done, to face some consequence, to understand that their actions had caused real harm. The plea deal would give me most of that. It wouldn't give me my family back, but I was beginning to accept that the family I'd wanted had never really existed in the first place. On the morning of the deadline, I called Marcus and told him to accept the deal. He said he thought it was the right choice. I hoped he was correct. The plea hearing was scheduled for late April. It was a smaller affair than the preliminary hearing, just the lawyers and the judge and the necessary parties. Brandon stood before the court and admitted guilt to identity theft and fraud. His voice was flat, emotionless, reading from a prepared statement. He acknowledged that he'd used my personal information without consent, that he'd forged my signature, and that his actions had caused me financial and emotional harm. The words were right, but they felt empty, a legal requirement rather than genuine remorse. My father sat in the gallery, his expression unchanged, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of his own role beyond what the legal agreement required. The judge accepted the plea and outlined the terms. Brandon would pay full restitution, complete 200 hours of community service, serve 3 years probation, and carry a felony conviction on his record. The financial crimes would follow him, affecting his ability to work in real estate or secure financing. His business was effectively finished. My father, as part of his agreement, had to pay a substantial fine and formally withdraw from any business dealings involving Brandon's projects. The judge made it clear that any violation of these terms would result in immediate prosecution and jail time. I watched it all from the back of the courtroom, present but apart, and felt a strange sense of disconnection. This was supposed to be the moment of resolution, of justice served, but mostly I just felt tired. When it was over, Marcus shook my hand and congratulated me. He said the outcome was as good as we could have hoped for. I thanked him for everything he'd done, meaning it sincerely. Without his guidance and support, I never would have made it this far. We finalized his payment, and I walked out of the courthouse into a bright April afternoon, the cherry blossoms blooming along the streets, the city carrying on with its usual rhythm, completely indifferent to the small personal drama that had just concluded. I didn't hear from my family after the plea hearing. No attempts at reconciliation, no acknowledgement of what had transpired, just silence. The restitution payments started arriving in my bank account, automatic transfers that showed up like clockwork. The credit bureaus corrected my reports, removing the fraudulent inquiries and the loan that had never been mine. On paper, I was being made whole. But there were some damages that couldn't be calculated in dollars or credit scores. In May, I made a decision that surprised even me. I started looking at real estate listings. Not apartments but actual houses, properties I could own. The restitution money combined with my savings gave me a real down payment for the first time in my life. I spent weekends touring neighborhoods, imagining different futures, trying to figure out what home meant when it wasn't tied to family or history or obligation. I looked at condos in the Pearl District, at bungalows in Sellwood, at newer construction in areas I'd never considered before. Then one afternoon, scrolling through listings while drinking coffee at my favorite cafe, I saw it. The house in the West Hills. My parents' house. The house I'd grown up in. It was listed as a short sale, priced well below market value. The description mentioning motivated sellers and quick close preferred. I stared at the listing for a long time, my coffee going cold, trying to process what I was seeing. My mother's words from our February meeting came back to me. They were behind on the mortgage. Brandon's legal troubles and failed business had pulled them down too. They were losing the house. I called the listing agent, a woman named Patricia who sounded tired and overworked. I asked about the property, playing it casual, not mentioning my connection. She explained that the sellers were experiencing financial hardship and needed to move quickly. The bank was pushing for a sale to avoid foreclosure. There had been some interest but nothing solid. I asked if I could see it. She scheduled a showing for the following day. I hung up and sat very still, my mind racing through the implications of what I was considering. The next afternoon, I pulled up to the house I'd been kicked out of on Christmas Eve. Patricia met me at the curb, all business professional smile and practice sales pitch. She didn't recognize my name, didn't make the connection. I followed her up the walkway where I'd stood holding $15 and a shattered sense of belonging. The inside looked different, smaller somehow, or maybe I was just different. The rooms that had loomed so large in my childhood felt ordinary now. Just spaces with walls and floors and the faint smell of the cedar my mother had always loved. Patricia walked me through each room, pointing out features and recent updates. The kitchen where I'd helped set the table on Christmas Eve. The living room where I'd laid out the loan documents. The study where my father and Brandon had laughed about my ignorance. Every space held ghosts of moments I'd spent trying to belong. Patricia asked if I had any questions. I asked about the seller's timeline. She said they were hoping to close within 30 days if possible, that they'd already moved to a rental property and just wanted this resolved. I nodded, doing calculations in my head. I made an offer that afternoon. Not the asking price but close enough to be competitive. Patricia called me that evening to say the sellers had accepted. She sounded relieved, like she'd been worried this sale would fall through like others had. We scheduled the inspection and appraisal. I contacted a mortgage broker and started the financing process. Through all of it, I moved with a calm certainty that felt almost surreal. I was buying my childhood home. The house my parents were losing. The house they'd shut me out of. And they had no idea I was the buyer. The closing was scheduled for mid-June. I met with Marcus to make sure everything was legally sound, that there were no conflicts of interest or issues with the transaction given my relationship to the sellers. He reviewed the paperwork and said it was clean. The sale was at arm's length, handled through proper channels, completely legitimate. He asked if I was sure about this, if I understood what it would mean. I told him I'd never been more sure of anything. This wasn't revenge, I explained. This was reclamation. The closing took place in a sterile conference room at a title company downtown. I sat on one side of the long table with my mortgage broker and Marcus, who'd come along for support even though his part in this was technically finished. On the other side sat Patricia and the seller's attorney, a young woman who looked fresh out of law school. My parents weren't present. In most real estate transactions, the sellers don't attend closing, just sign the documents beforehand and let their representatives handle the rest. I was grateful for their absence, even as part of me had perversely wanted to see their faces when they realized who was buying their home. The title officer walked us through the paperwork with bureaucratic efficiency. Disclosure forms, mortgage documents, insurance binders, transfer deeds, all the machinery of property changing hands. I signed each page carefully, my signature appearing over and over, each one legitimate and authorized, so different from the forged versions that had started this entire cascade of events. When we reached the final document, the actual deed that would make me the legal owner, I paused for just a moment. The title officer asked if there was a problem. I shook my head and signed. Just like that, the house was mine. Patricia shook my hand and congratulated me, saying she hoped I'd be very happy there. The seller's attorney gathered her papers and left quickly, probably rushing to another closing. Marcus waited until we were alone in the hallway before speaking. He told me that what I'd done was extraordinary, that most people wouldn't have had the strength to fight the way I had, and that watching me reclaim my power had been one of the most satisfying cases of his career. His words landed heavier than I expected. I thanked him for everything, for believing me when my own family hadn't, for treating my case like it mattered. We shook hands and went our separate ways. I drove to the house that was now legally mine, parking in the driveway instead of on the street. The keys felt significant in my hand, solid and real. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the afternoon light streaming through the windows I'd looked out of 1,000 times as a child. The house was empty now, my parents having moved out weeks ago. Their furniture was gone, the walls bare where family photos had hung. The spaces echoed with my footsteps as I walked from room to room, seeing everything with new eyes. In the kitchen, I stood where I'd stood on Christmas Eve, where my mother had been cutting pie when I'd set the loan documents on the coffee table. The memory played out like a film, all of us frozen in that moment of revelation. I could almost see Brandon's face, my father's rigid posture, my mother's confusion. But they were ghosts now, impressions of a past that no longer had power over me. I opened the back door and stepped onto the deck, looking out at the view of the city below, the skyline I'd grown up seeing, now belonging to me in a way it never had before. I spent the first night in the house sleeping on an air mattress in what had been my childhood bedroom. The room was smaller than I remembered, the window that had seemed so large when I was young now just ordinary. But something about being there, in that space, felt like closing a circle. I'd left this house with $15 and the certainty that I'd never belong anywhere. Now I owned it. Not through inheritance or gift, but through my own work, my own money, my own determination to build something that couldn't be taken away. The next morning, I called a property management company to discuss my plans. I didn't want to live in the house long term. It held too many complicated memories, and besides, I'd already started looking at condos downtown that felt more like mine, spaces with no history attached. What I wanted was to rent the house out, to make it productive, to turn it into an investment property that would generate income and build equity. The property manager, a competent woman named Rachel, came out that afternoon to assess the place. She said the West Hills location and the size of the house meant I could command premium rent. We discussed terms and she agreed to handle finding tenants and managing the property. Within 2 weeks, Rachel called with news. She had interested renters, a family relocating to Portland for work, looking for a year lease with option to extend. The rent they were willing to pay was more than enough to cover my mortgage and property management fees with money left over. I told Rachel to move forward with the application process. While that was happening, I hired contractors to do some basic updates, fresh paint, new carpets, minor repairs that would make the house more appealing. I walked through with the work crews, making decisions about colors and finishes, stamping my choices onto a space that had been defined by other people's preferences for so long. In July, the new tenants moved in. I wasn't there for it, didn't want to be. Rachel handled everything, the walkthrough, the key handoff, the orientation to the house's quirks and features. They were nice people from what Rachel told me, respectful of the property, excited about the neighborhood. They had no idea about the house's history, about the family drama that had led to its sale. To them it was just a beautiful home in a desirable location. I preferred it that way. I moved into my new condo in August, a modern unit downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The space was open and bright, nothing like the traditional craftsman I'd grown up in. I furnished it carefully, choosing each piece intentionally, building a home that reflected who I was now rather than who I'd been expected to be. I bought art from local galleries, installed shelves for my growing book collection, set up my workspace with the view I'd always wanted. Every choice was mine. Every corner belonged to me alone. The first rent payment from the West Hills property arrived in September. I stared at the deposit notification on my phone, seeing my parents' address listed as the property location, and felt something shift into place. They were paying me now. Not directly, since the tenants were the ones actually writing the checks, but the money flowed from that house to my account, a monthly reminder of how completely the power dynamic had reversed. I used part of that first payment to make an extra payment on my mortgage, accelerating the day when I'd own the property free and clear. I didn't hear anything from my family through the summer and into fall. The silence was total, a mutual agreement to pretend the others didn't exist. Then in October, nearly a year after that terrible Christmas Eve, I received an email from my mother. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a terse message asking if I knew who had bought their house. My stomach tightened as I read it. Someone must have told them, or maybe they'd finally looked up the public property records and seen my name on the deed. I debated not responding at all, but something made me reply. I wrote back with just 3 words. "I did, Mom." Her response came within minutes, a wall of text that was part accusation, part disbelief, part something that might have been grief. She said she couldn't believe I would do something so cruel, that buying the house out from under them was vindictive and heartless, that I'd taken my revenge too far. She said my father's health had been affected by the stress of everything that had happened. She said Brandon was struggling to find work with a felony record. She said I destroyed the family over money and pride. The email ended with a question that seemed genuine in its incomprehension. Was this really what I wanted? To see them suffer? I read her message 3 times, feeling the familiar pull of guilt, the old instinct to apologize, to make things easier for everyone else even at my own expense. But I'd learned something over the past year. Their suffering wasn't my responsibility. Their choices had led them here, just as my choices had led me to where I was. I wrote back carefully, keeping my tone neutral. I explained that I'd bought the house because it was a good investment opportunity, that I hadn't known it was their house until I saw the listing, which was technically true even if it left out the part where I'd chosen to move forward anyway. I told her that I hoped they were settling into their new situation, and that I wished them well, but that I wouldn't be discussing this further. Her next email arrived the following day. She wanted to meet. She said we needed to talk face to face, that there were things that couldn't be said over email, that she deserved a chance to explain. I almost deleted it without responding. Almost. But some part of me needed closure. Needed to have one final conversation where I could say the things I'd never been able to say before. I agreed to meet her at the same coffee shop where we'd met in February, the same neutral ground where she'd asked me to sacrifice myself for the family's financial security. She looked worse than she had in the spring. The months had aged her in visible ways, new gray in her hair, deeper lines around her eyes. We got our coffee and sat at the same window table. She started talking before I'd even settled into my chair, words spilling out in a rush. She told me about how they'd lost everything, how they'd had to move into a small rental in Beaverton, how the community they'd been part of had quietly distanced itself after the criminal charges and the scandal. She talked about my father's depression, about Brandon's inability to find decent work, about how the family had fractured under the weight of public judgment. I listened without interrupting, watching her face as she cataloged their losses. When she finally paused, I asked her a simple question. Did she understand why I pursued the fraud charges? She looked at me like I'd asked something incomprehensible. She said she understood I'd been hurt, but that what Brandon did was a mistake made under pressure, and that the punishment had far exceeded the crime. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even after everything, she still saw me as the problem. I was the one who'd overreacted. I was the one who'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to destroy rather than repair. I told her about Christmas Eve, about standing on the porch with $15, about watching Brandon smirk through the window. I told her about the years before that, about every dismissal, every casual cruelty, every moment I'd been made to feel like I was less important than my brother. I explained that the fraud wasn't an isolated incident, but the inevitable result of a family dynamic where I'd been taught I didn't matter. My voice stayed calm, factual, but I felt decades of suppressed anger flowing through every word. She tried to interrupt several times, but I kept talking, needing to finish, needing her to hear this, even if she couldn't truly understand it. When I was done, she sat in silence for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She told me I'd always been difficult, that from the time I was young I'd been sensitive and easily hurt, that I'd made things harder than they needed to be by taking everything so personally. She said Brandon had always been easier, more adaptable, better at fitting in. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was describing personality traits rather than revealing a fundamental rejection. And in that moment I understood completely. This would never change. She would never see me the way I needed to be seen. The family I'd wanted had never existed and never would. I told her I was sorry she felt that way, and I meant it. I was genuinely sorry that her perception was so fixed that she couldn't see past the narrative she'd built. But I also told her that I was done trying to change her mind, done trying to prove I was worthy of equal treatment, done sacrificing myself for people who would never value the sacrifice. I stood up and wished her well. She asked if this was really it, if I was really walking away from my family forever. I told her that they'd walked away from me first on Christmas Eve, and I was just finally accepting that reality. Then I left her sitting there, left my coffee half finished again, and walked out into an October afternoon that felt crisp and clean and full of possibility. The weeks after that meeting brought a strange sense of peace. I'd said what I needed to say. I'd closed the door I'd been leaving slightly ajar just in case. Now I could move forward without looking back, without waiting for an apology that would never come or a reconciliation that would require me to betray myself. I threw myself into my work, earning a promotion to senior analyst. I made new friends through a hiking group, people who knew me only as I was now, with no history to color their perception. I dated casually, nothing serious, just learning how to be open with people when you weren't constantly bracing for betrayal. In December, nearly a full year since Christmas Eve, I received a card in the mail. No return address, but I recognized my mother's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a generic holiday card, the kind you buy in bulk at the drugstore. She'd signed it simply with no message, no explanation. Just her name. I held it for a while, trying to decide what it meant, if it was an olive branch or just a reflexive social gesture. Eventually I set it on my counter where it stayed for a few days before I threw it away. I didn't send one back. Christmas that year I spent with Jennifer Walsh and her family. She'd invited me to their celebration weeks in advance, insisting that no one should be alone on the holidays. Her house was warm and chaotic, full of kids and dogs and the comfortable disorder of a family that actually liked each other. I helped in the kitchen, played board games, drank wine by the fireplace, and felt lighter than I had in years. This was what family could be when it wasn't built on hierarchy and favoritism and unspoken rules about who mattered and who didn't. When I left that night, Jennifer hugged me and told me I was welcome anytime. I believed her. The new year brought new rhythms. I established a routine that suited me, morning runs along the river, work that challenged and engaged me, evenings in my condo that felt peaceful rather than lonely. The rent from the West Hills property continued to arrive monthly, a steady reminder of how far I'd come. I'd started investing some of that income, building wealth deliberately and carefully, creating security that no one could take from me. Every financial decision I made was mine alone, considered and intentional. In February, I got a notification from the property management company. The tenants in the West Hills house wanted to extend their lease for another year. Rachel said they'd been model renters, taking good care of the property, never late with payment, respectful of neighbors. I approved the extension without hesitation. The longer they stayed, the more equity I built, the more distance I created from the house's emotional weight. Eventually it would just be an asset, a line item in my portfolio, nothing more complicated than that. Spring arrived with the cherry blossoms blooming again, marking the anniversary of the plea hearing, of justice being served in its imperfect way. I walked through downtown and thought about how much had changed in such a short time. 15 months ago I'd been standing on a porch with barely enough money for gas, cast out by the only family I'd known. Now I owned property, had a career I was proud of, had built a life that was wholly mine. The transformation wasn't magical or easy. It was the result of choosing myself over and over, even when that choice hurt, even when it meant losing people I desperately wanted to keep. I ran into Uncle Frank one afternoon at the farmer's market. He recognized me first, calling my name across the vegetable stands. We hadn't spoken since he'd quietly left on Christmas Eve, and I wasn't sure what to expect. But he pulled me aside and told me he wanted to apologize for not speaking up that night, for not defending me when he should have. He said he'd been too shocked to react properly, and that by the time he'd processed what was happening, I'd already left. I told him I appreciated that, and I did. His apology couldn't change what had happened, but it acknowledged that what had happened was wrong. He asked how I was doing, and I gave him the honest version. I told him about buying the house, about building my new life, about finally feeling like I was living on my own terms. He listened and nodded and then said something I'd needed to hear. He told me that what I'd done took more courage than most people ever have to summon, that standing up to family is one of the hardest things a person can do, and that he was proud of me. Coming from him, from someone who'd known me since I was born, who'd watched the family dynamics play out over decades, the words carried real weight. We exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. I actually believed we would. Summer came again, hot and dry, the kind of Portland weather that makes people forget the 9 months of rain. I took time off work and traveled to the coast, spending a week in a small rental cottage where I did nothing but read and walk the beach and think about the future. I'd spent so much of the past year dealing with the past that I hadn't given much thought to what I actually wanted going forward. Now, sitting on the sand watching the waves, I let myself imagine. Maybe grad school, expanding my skills in data science. Maybe a career change into something more creative. Maybe traveling internationally, seeing parts of the world I'd only read about. The possibilities stretched out like the horizon, vast and open. When I returned to Portland, there was a letter waiting for me. My father's handwriting on the envelope. I almost didn't open it, almost threw it away unread. But curiosity won. Inside was a single page. His words in the careful script he'd always used for important documents. He didn't apologize, not directly, but he acknowledged that things had unfolded in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wrote that he hoped I was well, that he thought about me often, and that he regretted how our last interaction had ended. The letter felt simultaneously like too much and not enough. Too much assumption that a few words could bridge the chasm between us, not enough actual accountability for the choices he'd made. I thought about responding, spent several evenings drafting replies in my head, but in the end I decided silence was the most honest answer I could give. I wasn't ready to forgive, wasn't sure I ever would be, and pretending otherwise would only create false hope. I filed the letter away in a drawer and moved on with my week. The rent payment arrived on schedule. I made my mortgage payment and watched my equity grow. Life continued its forward motion. In September, Rachel called with interesting news. The tenants had approached her about potentially buying the house when their lease ended. They loved the neighborhood, their kids were settled in good schools, and they wanted to put down permanent roots. She asked if I'd be interested in selling. I told her I'd think about it. The house had served its purpose, given me financial stability, and a tangible symbol of how completely I'd rebuilt my life. But I wasn't emotionally attached to it. If the price was right, if the timing made sense, I could let it go. I met with a financial advisor to discuss the implications. Selling would generate significant profit given how much the property had appreciated and how much equity I'd built. I could use that money to buy something else, to invest more aggressively, to fund the grad school I'd been considering. The advisor ran the numbers and said it was a strong opportunity if I was ready to move on. I realized I was. The house had been a bridge from one version of my life to another. I'd crossed that bridge. I didn't need to keep walking back and forth across it. I authorized Rachel to enter negotiations with the tenants. We arrived at a price that was fair for everyone, well above what I'd paid but reasonable for the current market. The closing was scheduled for November, almost 2 years after that Christmas Eve that had changed everything. This time I attended the closing, sitting across from the buyers, a kind couple in their 40s with 3 kids and a dog, and dreams of permanence in this house that had never quite felt permanent to me. I signed the documents transferring ownership and shook their hands and wished them happiness there. Walking out of the title company, I felt something lift. The house was no longer mine, and I was glad. I'd proven what I needed to prove, to myself more than anyone else. I could stand on my own. I could build something from nothing. I could survive betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. The check from the sale deposited into my account the next day. A number large enough to make me pause and really see it. This was mine. Earned through my resilience, my refusal to stay small, my willingness to choose myself even when it cost me everything else. I used some of the money to pay off my condo completely. The feeling of owning my home free and clear, of having no debt, of being completely financially independent, was better than I'd imagined. I set aside funds for grad school and started the application process for programs in data science and analytics. I invested the rest conservatively, building a portfolio that would generate passive income and long-term security. Every decision I made reinforced the foundation I was building, brick by brick, choice by choice. By the time December rolled around again, 2 full years since Christmas Eve, I felt like a completely different person inhabiting the same body. I'd shed the parts of myself that had been shaped by trying to fit into a family that had no room for me. What remained was harder, clearer, more authentically mine. I didn't spend the holidays alone this year. Jennifer invited me again, and I also connected with Uncle Frank, meeting him for coffee and catching up on the past months. He told me carefully that my parents had stabilized somewhat. They downsized their lives significantly but were managing. Brandon was working in sales, something unrelated to real estate, making enough to get by. The family had survived, just in a much diminished form. I listened and felt nothing but a distant acknowledgement of information. Their lives were no longer connected to mine except through the thinnest threads of shared history. I'd worried in the early months that I'd made a mistake, that I'd destroyed something that could have been repaired. But sitting there with Uncle Frank, comfortable in my own skin in a way I'd never been before, I knew I'd made the right choice. The only choice that honored who I actually was rather than who they'd wanted me to be. As the year turned and I stepped into another January, I thought about that girl on the porch with $15 and nowhere to go. I wanted to tell her that she'd survive this, that the family who dismissed her would one day be paying rent on a house she owned, that she'd build a life so much better than anything they could imagine for her, that being cast out would turn out to be the greatest gift they could have given her, even though they'd meant it as punishment. I wanted to tell her that 2 years from that moment, she'd be free in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. But she wouldn't have believed me. She had to walk the path herself to understand where it led. I stood in my condo looking out at the Portland skyline, the city lights reflecting off the river, the mountains barely visible in the winter darkness. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer asking about weekend plans. My laptop sat open with grad school applications in progress. The statement from my investment account showed steady growth. Everything I saw, everything I'd built, belonged to me completely. No one could take it away. No one could diminish it. No one could tell me it wasn't real or didn't matter. I'd started with nothing and created this. And if I could do it once, I could do it again, could keep building, keep growing, keep choosing myself every single day. The story could end here, with triumph and independence and the satisfaction of having proved everyone wrong. But that's not quite honest. Because some nights I still felt the loss of what I'd wanted family to be. Some mornings I woke up and had to remind myself that I'd made the right choice. Some holidays carried a shadow of grief for the people who should have loved me better. The happy ending wasn't simple or uncomplicated. It was real, which meant it held both joy and sorrow, both victory and loss. What mattered was that the life I was living was mine. Authentically, completely, unapologetically mine. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The spring of my 3rd year after that Christmas Eve brought changes I hadn't anticipated. I'd been accepted into a prestigious data science program at Portland State University, a 2-year commitment that would expand my career possibilities exponentially. The program was rigorous and demanding, requiring me to cut back my work hours to part-time while I focused on coursework and research. Financially, I was secure enough to make this work. The investment income from the house sale combined with my part-time salary covered my expenses comfortably. I had the freedom to invest in my future without the desperation that comes from living paycheck to paycheck. My first week of classes reminded me why I'd loved learning before family dynamics had complicated everything. I sat in lectures about machine learning algorithms and statistical modeling, surrounded by people who cared about ideas and solutions, rather than hierarchy and favoritism. My classmates came from diverse backgrounds, some straight from undergraduate programs, others like me returning to school after years in the workforce. We formed study groups and tackled problem sets together, and I discovered a kind of collaborative energy I'd never experienced in my corporate job. One of my study partners, a woman named Alicia who'd worked in healthcare analytics before grad school, became a genuine friend. We met for coffee between classes, compared notes on difficult professors, and gradually shared pieces of our lives that went beyond academics. It was Alicia who noticed first that I never mentioned my family. We'd been studying at a cafe near campus when her mother called, and I overheard her side of the conversation, full of warmth and easy affection. After she hung up, she asked casually about my family, whether they lived nearby if we were close. I gave her the abbreviated version, enough to explain the absence without drowning in details. I told her we were estranged, that there had been a significant betrayal, and that we no longer had contact. She didn't push for more information, just nodded with understanding and said she was sorry. That family stuff was always complicated. Her acceptance of my boundaries without judgment felt like a small gift. As spring turned to summer, I settled into the rhythm of graduate school. My days were full of classes, research, and study sessions. My evenings were spent either working on assignments or occasionally socializing with classmates. I'd built a life that felt balanced and purposeful, oriented around growth rather than survival. The contrast with where I'd been 3 years ago was so stark that sometimes I'd stop in the middle of a normal day and just feel grateful for the distance I'd traveled. I was building expertise that would make me more valuable professionally. I was forming relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. I was living proof that you could lose your family and still create a meaningful life. In July, I received an unexpected email from Brandon. The message sat in my inbox for 2 days before I opened it, the preview text showing only his name and a timestamp. When I finally clicked on it, brace for anger or manipulation or some new attempt to rewrite history, what I found was something quieter. He wrote that he'd been thinking about everything that had happened, that he'd had a lot of time to reflect during his probation and community service. He said he understood now that what he'd done was wrong, not just legally but morally, that he'd violated my trust in ways he couldn't fully comprehend at the time. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. He simply acknowledged the harm he'd caused and said he was sorry. I read the email 3 times, searching for hidden agendas or manipulation tactics. But the tone felt genuine in a way his courtroom apology hadn't. This wasn't a legal requirement or a strategy to reduce consequences. This seemed like an actual human being grappling with what he'd done. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I saved the email to a folder and let it sit while I processed my reaction. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to maintain the clear boundary I'd established. But another part recognized that people could change, that growth was possible even for someone who'd hurt me as deeply as Brandon had. After a week of consideration, I wrote back. My response was brief and carefully worded. I thanked him for the apology and acknowledged that it took courage to send. I told him I wasn't ready for any kind of relationship or regular contact, but that I appreciated him taking responsibility for his actions. I said I hoped he was building a better life for himself and wished him well. Then I sent it before I could second-guess myself. His reply came a few hours later. Just 2 sentences thanking me for responding and respecting my boundaries. After that, silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Not hostile or wounded, just neutral. 2 people who'd once been family acknowledging each other's existence, and then moving on with separate lives. The fall semester brought new challenges. I was taking advanced courses that pushed me to the edge of my abilities, working with complex datasets and building predictive models that required both technical skill and creative problem solving. One of my professors, Dr. Sarah Kim, took an interest in my work and invited me to join her research team studying healthcare disparities using large-scale data analysis. The opportunity was exactly the kind of thing I'd hoped graduate school would provide. A chance to apply my skills to meaningful problems while learning from someone at the top of the field. I accepted immediately and found myself working 20 hours a week on the research project in addition to my coursework and part-time job. The pace was intense but energizing. I thrived under the pressure, discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Dr. Kim pushed her team hard but fairly, expecting excellence while also providing mentorship and support. Working with her reminded me of what healthy authority looked like. Someone who held high standards without using power as a weapon, who challenged you because they believed in your potential, rather than to prove their superiority. I found myself talking with her during office hours about more than just research, sharing some of my background and the path that had led me to this program. She listened with genuine interest and shared her own story of leaving a difficult family situation to pursue her education. The parallels weren't exact, but the underlying theme was the same. Sometimes you had to choose yourself even when it meant losing people you loved. Winter arrived with the kind of heavy rain that defines Portland, the city turning gray and soggy for months. I didn't mind it the way I used to. The weather felt appropriate for the internal work I was doing, processing years of complicated emotions while simultaneously building toward a future that finally felt like my own. I spent quiet evenings in my condo working on research analysis, The sound of rain against the windows creating a cocoon of focus. My social life had expanded to include regular gatherings with classmates, occasional dinners with Jennifer and her family, and coffee dates with Uncle Frank every few months. I wasn't isolated, but I also wasn't performing connection the way I'd done in my family of origin. Every relationship I maintained was chosen deliberately, based on mutual care rather than obligation. In January, 4 years after Christmas Eve, I got a message from Rachel at the property management company. She'd stayed in touch even after the house sale, occasionally sending referrals my way when friends needed data analysis work. This message was different though. She'd heard through the real estate network that my parents' rental in Beaverton was being sold by the owner, and they were looking for a new place. She wanted to give me a heads up in case they ended up applying for any properties I might be connected to in the future. I thanked her for the information and felt a strange detachment. Their housing situation wasn't my concern or responsibility. They'd find something. They'd manage. Just like I had managed when they kicked me out with $15. February brought an unexpected development in my research work. Dr. Kim's team had produced findings significant enough to warrant publication in a major public health journal. My contribution to the data analysis was substantial enough that I'd be listed as second author on the paper, a credential that would be invaluable when I entered the job market after graduation. We celebrated at a local restaurant, the whole research team gathering to mark the achievement. As I sat there surrounded by colleagues who respected my work and valued my contributions, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced in my family. This was what it felt like to be seen for what you actually brought to the table rather than being assigned a role based on birth order and parental preference. Spring semester brought my thesis work into focus. I'd chosen to study predictive modeling for identifying at-risk populations in healthcare systems, work that combined my technical skills with a desire to contribute to something meaningful. The research was demanding and sometimes frustrating, full of dead ends and models that didn't perform as expected. But it was mine in a way nothing had been before. Every decision, every direction, every conclusion came from my own analysis and judgment. Dr. Kim provided guidance and feedback, but the work itself belonged to me. I spent long hours in the computer lab running analyses, tweaking algorithms, interpreting results. The process was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. In April, I presented my preliminary findings at a graduate research conference. Standing at the podium in front of a room full of academics and professionals, I felt none of the old anxiety about being judged or dismissed. I knew my work was solid. I'd done the analysis rigorously. I could defend every choice I'd made. The presentation went well, drawing engaged questions from the audience and positive feedback from several professors in attendance. Afterward, a woman from a major healthcare analytics firm approached me with her card, saying they were always looking for people with my skill set, and to reach out when I was ready to enter the job market. I pocketed the card and felt possibility expanding around me. May brought the 4th anniversary of that night I'd been kicked out. I marked it privately, taking myself out to dinner at a nice restaurant overlooking the river. I thought about the girl I'd been then, heartbroken and frightened and certain her life was ending. I wished I could tell her that it was actually just beginning, that losing her family would force her to find herself, and that the self she'd find would be stronger and more authentic than anything she could have become while trying to fit into their mold. I ordered champagne and toasted silently to survival, to resilience, to the long journey from that porch to this table. Summer brought the intensity of thesis writing. I spent June and July chained to my laptop, translating months of research into a coherent narrative that would satisfy my committee and contribute something new to the field. The writing process was harder than the analysis had been, requiring me to articulate not just what I'd found but why it mattered, how it connected to existing literature, what implications it held for future research and practical application. I worked through multiple drafts, incorporating feedback from Dr. Kim and my other committee members, refining arguments and strengthening evidence. By August I had a complete draft that I was actually proud of, a document that represented the culmination of 2 years of intensive work and intellectual growth. My thesis defense was scheduled for early September. I prepared obsessively, anticipating every possible question, reviewing every aspect of my methodology and findings. The night before the defense, Alicia took me out for a drink to calm my nerves. She reminded me that I knew this material better than anyone, that my committee wouldn't have approved the defense if they didn't think I was ready, and that in 24 hours this would all be over and I'd have my master's degree. Her confidence in me helped settle the anxiety that had been building for weeks. The defense itself was less terrifying than I'd anticipated. My committee asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated they'd actually read and engaged with my work. I answered clearly, drawing on months of deep immersion in the material. There were moments of challenge where committee members pushed back on my interpretations or suggested alternative explanations, but I held my ground when I was confident and acknowledged limitations honestly when appropriate. After 90 minutes, they asked me to step out while they deliberated. I paced the hallway for 15 minutes that felt like hours. When they called me back in, Dr. Kim was smiling. I'd passed. I had my degree. The graduation ceremony in October was small and meaningful. I invited Jennifer and her family, Uncle Frank, Alicia, and a few other classmates I'd grown close to during the program. We gathered afterward for lunch at a restaurant in the Pearl District, and I felt surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated my achievement. Uncle Frank pulled me aside at one point and told me my parents would be proud if they could see past their own hurt and defensiveness. I appreciated the sentiment even though I doubted its accuracy. My accomplishment didn't fit the narrative they'd built about who I was, and people rarely revise their stories, even when confronted with contradictory evidence. With my degree completed, I faced the question of what came next. The healthcare analytics firm that had approached me at the conference made a formal offer, a senior analyst position with a salary that was nearly double what I'd been making before graduate school. The work would be challenging and aligned with my research interests. I accepted and gave notice at my part-time job, preparing to transition back into full-time professional life, but at a much higher level than where I'd left off. The difference between entering this job with advanced credentials and proven research experience versus where I'd been 5 years ago was staggering. I'd invested in myself and the investment was paying dividends. I started the new position in November, joining a team of data scientists working on population health analytics for a major hospital system. The work was exactly what I'd hoped for: complex problems that required both technical sophistication and domain knowledge, collaboration with smart colleagues who challenged and inspired me, and the sense that what we were doing actually mattered for patient outcomes. My manager was impressed with my background and quickly gave me increasing responsibility. Within my first month, I was leading a project examining readmission patterns for chronic disease patients, work that drew directly on my thesis research. December arrived, and with it the 5-year anniversary of Christmas Eve. I took time on the actual date to reflect on the journey. 5 years ago I'd stood on a porch with $15, cast out and certain I'd never recover. Now I had a master's degree, a high-level job I'd earned through my own capabilities, a home I owned outright, investments that provided security, and relationships built on genuine connection rather than obligation. The transformation was so complete that sometimes it felt like those events had happened to a different person. In many ways they had. The Tori who'd been kicked out no longer existed. She'd been broken down and rebuilt into someone stronger. I didn't hear from my family on the anniversary. I hadn't expected to. But a few days later, Uncle Frank called and asked if he could stop by. When he arrived, he seemed nervous in a way I hadn't seen before. We sat in my living room with coffee, and he told me he'd had lunch with my parents recently. They'd asked about me, wanted to know how I was doing. He'd told them in general terms, mentioned the graduate degree and the new job. My mother had cried. My father had gone quiet. Uncle Frank said he got the impression they were beginning to understand what they'd lost, though neither would say it directly. He asked gently if I'd ever consider reaching out to them. I sat with the question, really considering it rather than reflexively refusing. After a long pause, I told him the truth. I didn't trust them. Even if they regretted how things had unfolded, even if they'd achieved some understanding of their role in the destruction of our relationship, I didn't believe they'd actually changed in the fundamental ways that would be necessary for reconciliation. They'd shown me who they were over the course of my entire life, and I'd finally learned to believe them. Letting them back in would require vulnerability. I wasn't willing to offer people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with it. Uncle Frank nodded sadly but didn't argue. He said he understood and that he'd continue to maintain separate relationships with everyone, that he wouldn't push me or carry messages between us. I appreciated his respect for my boundaries. After he left, I sat for a long time looking out at the city lights, thinking about forgiveness and reconciliation and whether they were actually the same thing. I'd worked hard to let go of active anger, to stop rehashing old hurts, to build a life not defined by what had been done to me. In that sense, I'd forgiven them. But forgiveness didn't require restoration of relationship. I could wish them well from a distance while also protecting myself from further harm. The new year brought new opportunities. My work at the healthcare analytics firm was gaining attention, with several of my projects being presented to hospital leadership and influencing actual policy decisions. I was building a reputation as someone who could take complex data and translate it into actionable insights. In February, I was promoted to lead analyst, managing a small team and taking on more strategic responsibility. The promotion came with another significant salary increase, and the kind of professional recognition I'd never imagined possible when I was the overlooked daughter in a family that valued only one child's achievements. I used some of my increased income to do something I'd been thinking about for a while. I established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students studying data science or analytics. The fund was modest but meaningful, enough to cover books and supplies for a couple of students each year. I set it up anonymously, not wanting recognition but wanting to create opportunity for people who might not have family support for their education. In some way it felt like honoring the girl I'd been, the one who'd had to build everything herself because no one was going to build it for her. Spring brought an unexpected encounter. I was at a coffee shop near my office waiting in line when I heard someone say my name. I turned to find Ashley, Brandon's wife, standing behind me. We hadn't seen each other since the plea hearing 6 years ago. She looked different, older certainly, but also somehow lighter, like she'd put down a weight she'd been carrying. We exchanged awkward greetings, both clearly unsure how to navigate this chance meeting. She asked if we could sit for a minute, and something in her tone made me agree. We found a corner table and she started talking. She told me she and Brandon had divorced 2 years ago, that the stress of his legal troubles and business failures had exposed problems in their marriage that had been there all along. She'd realized she'd been playing a role in the family drama, supporting Brandon's entitlement and participating in the dismissal of me because it benefited her position in the family hierarchy. She said she'd been thinking about that a lot in therapy, about how she'd compromised her own values to maintain status in a system that was fundamentally broken. She apologized for her part in everything that had happened. Her apology was more thorough and genuine than anything I'd received from my actual family. She didn't make excuses or minimize her role. She simply acknowledged that she'd been wrong and said she was sorry. I accepted her apology and thanked her for having the courage to offer it. We talked for another hour, catching up on our separate lives. She'd gone back to school herself, was working as a social worker now, had found purpose in helping families navigate difficult dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Before we parted, she told me she admired what I'd built for myself, that leaving the Hayes family had clearly been the right choice, and that she wished she'd had my strength years earlier. I watched her walk away and felt a strange sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. Summer brought my 30th birthday, a milestone that felt significant in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I'd entered my 20s still trying to earn my family's approval, still believing that if I just tried hard enough I could make them see me. I was entering my 30s as someone who'd stopped seeking external validation, who'd built her worth from the inside out, who'd learned that the only approval that really mattered was her own. I celebrated with a small gathering of friends, people who knew me as I actually was and valued me for it. No one at that party had known me during my family years. They only knew the person I'd become after, and there was freedom in that. In August, I received an email from a literary agent who'd somehow heard about my story. She said she represented authors who wrote memoirs about overcoming family estrangement and rebuilding their lives, and she thought my experience might resonate with readers. She asked if I'd ever considered writing about what I'd been through. I hadn't, not seriously, though I journaled extensively during the hardest years as a way to process everything. The idea of turning that private work into something public made me uncomfortable. But it also intrigued me. How many other people were out there struggling with similar situations, believing they were alone in choosing themselves over toxic family bonds? I told the agent I'd think about it. Over the next few weeks, I went back through my old journals, reading entries from Christmas Eve, from the months of legal proceedings, from the day I bought the house, from my thesis defense. I saw patterns in my own thinking, the gradual shift from victim to survivor to someone actively building a life she chose. There was a story there. Not just about family betrayal but about resilience and self-creation. I decided to try writing a proposal. The agent loved it and sent it out to publishers. Within a month I had a book deal. Writing the memoir was harder than writing my thesis had been. The research and analysis of my graduate work had been intellectually challenging but emotionally distant. This required me to revisit painful memories, to articulate feelings I worked hard to move past, to be vulnerable in ways that felt risky and exposing. But it also forced me to see my story as a complete arc, to understand how each terrible moment had been necessary to get me to where I'd ended up. I spent evenings and weekends writing, working with an editor who helped me shape the narrative and find the universal themes within my specific experience. The book was published the following spring, 7 years after Christmas Eve. I did a small book tour, mostly local readings and podcast interviews. The response surprised me. I heard from dozens of people who'd experienced similar family dynamics, who'd been the scapegoat or the forgotten child, who'd had to choose between self-preservation and family loyalty. Many of them thanked me for validating their experiences, for showing that it was possible to build a meaningful life after family estrangement. Some of their stories were worse than mine, some were different in the details but identical in the emotional core. I realized I'd tapped into something much larger than my individual situation. One evening after a reading, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she'd been kicked out by her family 6 months ago, that she was sleeping on a friend's couch and working 2 jobs and barely holding on. She said my book had given her hope that this wasn't the end of her story, just a painful middle. I hugged her and told her what I wished someone had told me 7 years ago, that it gets better, that she's stronger than she knows, that the family who cast her out would one day regret it, but by then she'd be so far beyond needing their validation that their regret wouldn't matter. She thanked me and left, and I stood there feeling like maybe all the pain had served some purpose after all. The book's success led to speaking opportunities. I was invited to conferences and workshops about family estrangement, about rebuilding after betrayal, about financial independence for women. I spoke at universities and community centers, sharing my story but also the practical strategies I'd use to survive and eventually thrive. I talked about the importance of therapy, of building chosen family, of investing in yourself even when it feels selfish, of understanding that you can't fix people who don't want to change. I shared the financial steps I'd taken, from prosecuting the fraud to buying property to building investments. People took notes. They asked questions. They told me afterward that I'd helped them feel less alone. Through all of this, I still didn't hear from my parents directly, but Uncle Frank mentioned occasionally that they followed my career from a distance, that they bought my book though he didn't know if they'd actually read it. He said my mother kept a clipping from a local newspaper article about my work in healthcare analytics. These small gestures of attention from afar felt sad more than anything else. They were still incapable of actually reaching out, of apologizing, of attempting any real reconciliation. They could only observe my success from a safe distance where it didn't challenge their narrative or require them to examine their own behavior. I turned 32 in the summer, celebrating with a vacation to Iceland that I'd been planning for months. I hiked glaciers and soaked in hot springs and watched the midnight sun paint the sky in colors I'd never seen before. I thought about how far I'd traveled, not just physically but in every way that mattered. I'd gone from a girl who believed her worth was determined by her family's opinion to a woman who knew her value came from within. I'd transformed trauma into purpose, pain into growth, loss into liberation. I'd built exactly the life I wanted, brick by brick, choice by choice, without anyone's permission or approval. When I returned from Iceland, there was a letter waiting for me. My mother's handwriting on the envelope, thicker than usual. Inside were several pages, front and back, her careful script filling every inch. She'd written what she'd been unable to say in person or over the phone for 7 years. She acknowledged the way she'd failed me as a mother, the favoritism she'd shown Brandon, the time she'd dismissed my feelings and needs. She took responsibility for enabling my father's harsh treatment and Brandon's entitled behavior. She said she'd read my book 3 times, that each reading had broken her heart a little more, that she'd finally understood how completely she'd lost me through her own choices. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply said she was sorry, that she wished she could go back and do everything differently, that she hoped I was happy even though she played no part in that happiness. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, that she'd earned my absence. But she wanted me to know that she saw me now, really saw me, even though it was too late for that sight to matter. The letter was everything I'd needed to hear as a child and young adult, offered now when I'd moved so far beyond needing it that it felt almost irrelevant. I read the letter multiple times over several days, analyzing my reaction. I felt sad for the relationship we'd never had and never would have. I felt grateful that she'd finally achieved some self-awareness, even if it came too late to repair anything. I felt proud of myself for building a life so complete that her words, while meaningful, didn't fundamentally change anything about my sense of worth or well-being. After a week, I wrote back. My response was brief but kind. I thanked her for the letter and acknowledged that it took courage to write. I told her I'd forgiven her in the sense that I'd let go of active anger and resentment, but that forgiveness didn't mean restoration of relationship. I said I hoped she found peace with her choices and her regrets, and I wished her well. Then I mailed it and let it go. The years that followed brought continued growth and new challenges. I advanced further in my career, eventually becoming director of analytics for a major healthcare system. I published more research. I bought a small weekend house on the Oregon coast where I could escape the city and write and think. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, still learning how to be intimate with people when your earliest lessons about love involved betrayal and conditional acceptance. I maintained my chosen family, the friends and mentors and colleagues who saw me clearly and valued me consistently. I lived well. Now, 10 years after that Christmas Eve, I can look back at the whole arc and see it clearly. Being kicked out with $15 was the worst thing that ever happened to me. It was also the catalyst for becoming the person I was always meant to be, unencumbered by the limits my family had placed on me. I own property and investments worth more than my parents' house ever was. I have credentials and expertise they never imagined I'd achieve. I've written a book that's helped thousands of people. I've built a career that contributes something meaningful to the world. And I've done it all without their help or approval, or even their knowledge for most of the journey. Sometimes people ask if I regret pursuing the fraud charges, if I wish I'd found some way to reconcile with my family instead. The answer is complicated. I regret that I was born into a family incapable of loving me as I deserved. I regret the years I spent trying to earn something that should have been freely given. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret refusing to be a silent victim of their dysfunction. I don't regret choosing truth and justice over false peace. Those choices hurt, cost me relationships I'd wanted to keep, forced me to rebuild my entire life from nothing. But they also freed me. And freedom, I've learned, is worth almost any price. I still see Uncle Frank regularly. We have dinner every few months and catch up on our lives. He's the only connection I maintain to that part of my history, and even that's more about our individual relationship than any family obligation. He tells me occasionally that my parents are aging, that my father's health isn't great, that my mother talks about regrets. He never pushes me to reach out, respects that I've made my choice and have reasons for it. I appreciate his ability to hold space for everyone without trying to force reconciliation. Last month I spoke at a conference about family estrangement and financial recovery. Afterward, a young man approached me and asked how I'd known I was making the right choice when I pursued legal action against my brother. He was facing a similar situation and terrified of the consequences. I told him what I'd learned over 10 years of living with my decision, that choosing yourself over toxic family is terrifying and lonely and painful, that you'll doubt yourself 1,000 times, that people will judge you and misunderstand and tell you family should forgive anything, but that on the other side of that fear and pain is a freedom you can't imagine until you're living it. The freedom to be fully yourself without apologizing or shrinking or performing. The freedom to build a life that actually fits who you are. The freedom to walk away from people who hurt you, even when they share your blood. He thanked me with tears in his eyes and walked away to make his own hard choice. I don't know what he decided, but I hope he chose himself. I hope he understood that you can survive losing your family of origin and thrive. I hope he learned what I learned, that the people who truly love you will never ask you to betray yourself for their comfort. And that anyone who does ask that isn't actually loving you at all, no matter what they call the relationship. I'm sitting in my coastal house as I finish writing this, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch toward the horizon. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seem impossible, but are absolutely real. I'm drinking wine from a bottle I bought in Iceland. I'm wearing comfortable clothes in a house I own outright. Tomorrow I'll return to Portland and my job and my chosen family, and the life I've built. It's a good life. Better than good. It's mine, completely and authentically mine. Built from rubble and determination and the refusal to stay small. If you told that girl on the porch 10 years ago, crying and terrified with $15 and nowhere to go, that she'd end up here, she wouldn't have believed you. She couldn't have imagined this version of herself, strong and successful and free. But she got here anyway, one painful step at a time, choosing herself over and over even when it felt impossible. And if she could do it, so can anyone else who finds themselves cast out and counted out and left with nothing but their own resilience. The ending isn't written when your family rejects you. That's just the beginning of a different story. One where you get to be the author. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.